Hello everyone, my name is Faris. I'm a Kuwaiti writer and performance poet, and I wrote this lecture for Dr. Shahd Al-Shammari's poetry class at the Gulf University for Science and Technology. The lecture is titled, Does Literature Impact the World? And I thought it might be helpful to alert my students to the importance of literature, an importance that goes beyond message, theme, or even morals and principles of the authors who write the texts. I believe that literature is important beyond those things, and that we need to be able to engage with it on a personal level because it has impacted every aspect of civilization or humanization. It is part and parcel of what makes us human. And therefore, it's important to start teaching students how to strategically and consciously engage with literature in a way that is conducive to their own growth and to their own interests, in a way that's going to answer their own questions or at least help them articulate their own concerns, because I think it has impacted every area of our life. And it was very interesting. I gave this class already. This is a recording I'm doing later so that I can upload the resource online for people to watch it who weren't in this class. But I really liked it. I liked the response. I liked it the way that the students engaged with the material. So hopefully this inspires some of you as well. If it does, stay in touch with me. Write comments below. Hit a like on this video. But definitely visit my website, www.nadafaris.com. And if you'd like me to come to your class as well and to talk more about literature, I'd love to attend. So without further ado, this is the lecture that I wrote for the poetry class at Gust. Does literature impact the world? We live in a society that belittles literature because people view it as a dissemination of falsehoods, right? People say nonfiction is writing that is based on facts, while fiction is writing that is based on a fabrication of reality. But not only does the critique of literature begin with the separation between truth and falsehoods, or facts and fiction, but this distinction is then taken to mean that literature distracts us from the real world. Because artists and writers spend so much of their time creating fake works, dabbling in lies and in make-believe, their engagement with falsehoods distract readers and audiences from participating in the real world, and it distorts their understanding of truth with a capital T. Poetry is also seen as frivolous today because most of it is lyrical, and subjective expressions of reality are viewed in contrast to what is deemed objective and factual. But even more so than being false, poetry today is often dismissed as a luxurious engagement with language that is also separate from the real world. So who has time and energy and money to become a poet? Right? Definitely not the working class, because the working class are people who never receive education and who are struggling merely to survive. Thus, poetry is something only the rich and privileged can do. People don't throw this argument at doctors. They don't say, for instance, it's a meaningless job that is only reserved for the rich and privileged, right? Because you need many years of education and training and devotion to become a doctor. So people don't use this argument against doctors because for them, the impact of medicine is immediate and visible. They see it with their eyes every time they visit the hospital. Well, a doctor saves lives, they say. So if only the privileged can become doctors, it's still meaningful. Whereas poetry is just rich people sitting around messing with the dictionary and speaking to the poets of the past in a language that the working class cannot understand. That's the argument in a nutshell. Doctors may be privileged, but at least they are saving lives. And poets are privileged, but they engage in falsehoods. And not only do they not save lives, but they also distract people from participating in the real world. Yes, it's true that being either a doctor or a poet would require years of dedication. And when you're trying to survive, those years of dedication might be difficult to find time for. But of course, we already know this argument is false because history has given us many doctors and many poets from the working class, right? Wanting to save lives in the medical field and wanting to be creative. These things are human instincts. These things are built inside of us. So it transcends race, it transcends class, it transcends gender. A lot of poets have come to us from different classes, and a lot of doctors have come to us from different classes. But yet still, this argument is persistent. And it critiques other forms of art, such as plays or paintings or music or dancing. In similar ways, they say literature and art in general are less important than disciplines which deal with facts rather than aspects of our imagination. So I want to start with these distinctions. First, the distinction between truth and falsehood. And second, the distinction between the real world, or the world we live in, and the world of the imagination, or the world we perceive through the human senses. Over the past 10 years, I have spoken to many people in Kuwait across various cultural events, and one statement frequently makes an appearance. Someone will usually say to me with a bit of arrogance and some swagger to let me know that they have made better life decisions than me. They'll say something like, I never bother with fiction and poetry. I only read nonfiction because it's in the business of telling the truth about the world, whereas fiction and poetry perpetuate nothing but lies. And I've met many people who support reading and writing as virtues in general, but who will then claim that books on religion, architecture, history, science, philosophy, the environment, critical theory, politics, technology, and even biographies of footballers or self-help books or books on dieting are more valuable than fiction, poetry, or plays. And they'll rehash the same argument about the difference between facts and fiction and the difference between material that helps someone engage with the real world and material that distracts someone from the demands of real life. So this is perhaps one of the oldest critiques in literature. Plato makes it in his Republic, namely that literature and the arts are misleading people from the truth by presenting lies, and artists have spent thousands of years trying to rebut this accusation. But Plato accuses literature of being false while at the same time relying on Homer's poetry to define and interpret notions of truth and justice. And thus his philosophy itself came out of poetry. This is the same with most non-fictional discourses. For instance, Sigmund Freud, the godfather of psychoanalysis, referred to the texts of the Greek playwright Sophocles when he attempted to conceptualize the human psyche. And Karl Marx, the godfather of the critique of capitalism, referred to the texts of the French playwright and novelist Balzac when he attempted to challenge the dominant socio-economic order of his time. Literature and its elements matter in the Islamic tradition as well. For example, Muslims believe the Quran is the only miracle given to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who is often described as illiterate. Yet despite his inability to read and write, Muslims believe the Prophet bequeathed a text that is rich with beauty and information. However, the Quran is also a text that requires interpretation, and Muslims can only understand the meanings of the Quranic phrases when they analyze the holy text, which is itself full of elements that belong to the field of literature. For instance, allegory, repetition, parallelism, metaphors, alliteration, synecdoche, conceits, and so on. In other words, you cannot get to the Quran's truth if you do not understand literature. Because figurative language is not a decoration for the text, rather figurative language is itself building blocks of meaning without which language, even the non-fictional kind, simply does not exist. But not only is non-fiction itself shaped by literary discourse, the real world also is inseparable from its cultural productions. A while back, I wrote an article for Bazaar magazine titled Lessons from Literary History, Texts That Changed the World. I wrote this article as a response to a prevalent sentiment at the time. Unfortunately, this stance remains popular today, and it goes something like this. The real world is built on the backs of real people doing real things. Thus, it is more important to spend time affecting the world than reading lies about it in poems, novels, or screenplays, and so on. These people, like Plato, take the division between fiction and nonfiction or truth and falsehood as fact, even when reality itself contradicts their starting point. And so in my article, I delineated several instances in which real life, the real people who propel the world into different trajectories, and the real events they trigger, were themselves influenced by literature. Take language and identity. Today we think of the English language as a lingua franca, or a global language penetrating all aspects of society. And if you're politically minded, you might have heard your friends equate the English language itself with colonization. So for them, English is colonial. But the English language did not start out as a lingua franca, nor was it always England's language of government. In the early Middle Ages, England used Latin in matters of theology, and it used French in matters of government. So, for example, the church utilized Latin, and government officials communicated in French. But Geoffrey Chaucer's collection of poems, the Canterbury Tales, published in the 14th century, helped to elevate the usage of the English language, and subsequent writers then followed in his footsteps. Eventually, through literature, the English language became sophisticated enough for the English government to adopt it on a national level, and then, of course, on an imperial level. English then became an identity mark. It became inseparable from Englishness, but that wasn't always the case. And like I said, Geoffrey Chaucer's collections of poems, which were not about what it means to be English, how do the morals and principles of English people look like. The poems were not about that. Like if you read those poems, they were raunchy, they were naughty, they were funny, they were amazing. But what he was trying to do is to elevate spoken peasant language to the status of literature. And that led to the impact later that we saw, where English became inseparable from Englishness. And something similar happened with Dante earlier, and would happen later with Whitman. So Dante Alighieri was born in Florence in what is now Italy in the middle of the 13th century. At the time he was writing, Latin was the language of the scribes, yet Dante wanted to write poems in the vernacular, or in the language of the people, and his work also helped to elevate the Italian language from being spoken by the peasants in Florence to the language of the elite, of art, and of government, and eventually Italian then became the language also of a colonizing nation. And this happened with Walter Whitman, who was an American poet born in the beginning of the 19th century. And when he was writing, most people in the Anglophone world were following in the footsteps of British writers, because by then, English had very much become inseparable from Englishness as an identity. And so Whitman wanted to liberate American poetry from that British association. And he started writing in free verse and utilized slang and spoken American cadence, as well as explicit themes in his poetry that regular Americans were talking about in daily life, but that British writers were not discussing in their texts. So his book of poems, The Leaves of Grass, did not only impact American English as a language, it also helped to shape and define Americanness as an identity, and it remains impactful on both fronts today. So in addition to impacting our non-fictional discourses, as well as languages and identities of various nations, literature has shaped the political world we've inherited today. Take Jamal Abdel Nasser as an example. He was the mastermind of the French Officer Revolution in Egypt in 1952. which terminated the 183-year-old dynasty of Muhammad Ali Pasha, the Ottoman Albanian commander who conquered Egypt in 1769. Egypt's revolution spawned similar military coups in Iraq. A group of officers ended the pro-British Hashemite government of Nouri Said and Faisal II in 1958. Military officers in Syria toppled Nazim al-Qudsi's government in 1963. Muammar al-Gaddafi modeled Libya's revolution in 1969 on Jamal Abdel Nasser's and toppled King Idris Abdelaziz al-Shalhi. And finally, there was a failed attempt to assimilate the Egyptian takeover in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, focusing on princes instead of military officers, dubbed the Free Officers Revolution instead of the Free Officers. Dubbed the Free Princes Revolution instead of the Free Officers Revolution. This movement was spearheaded by Talal bin Abdulaziz Al Saud. So, Jamal Abdel Nasser's philosophy on Arab unity in opposition to the colonial powers irrevocably redrew the power dynamics in the region. It is thus interesting to note that Anne Alexander writes in Nasser, His Life and Times, that Jamal Abdel Nasser had modeled his persona as a revolutionary figure on the protagonist of Tawfiq al-Hakim's novel, Return of the Spirit, or Awdat al-Ruh, published in 1933. Which fictionalized the accounts of Egypt's 1919 revolution. In other words, Jamal Abdel Nasser loved a fictional character so much that he decided to model his real-life persona after him. And because he did not want to repeat the mistakes of the fictional character who failed in the fictional 1919 revolution, Jamal Abdel Nasser thought of ways to do things differently. And several revolutionaries in different parts of the Arab world then followed his example, forever changing the reality for most people in our region. Side note, when Jamal Abdel Nasser became president, finally, of Egypt's republic, he invited Tawfiq al-Hakim to the palace to thank him, basically, for the book that he wrote, which inspired him and made him the revolutionary that he was. And Tawfiq al-Hakim refused to come. He wasn't pleased by what Jamal Abdel Nasser did with his book. But let's look at another example. Let's look at a much bigger example, because the Jamal Abdel Nasser example has touched the lives of every single Arab everywhere in the world, right? But let's look at an even broader example. For instance, slavery. In America, right before the Civil War, there was a raging debate about whether or not slavery was constitutional and moral. While the debate had been going on for years, the Cambridge Companion to Harriet Beecher Stowe, in the Cambridge Companion to Harriet Beecher Stowe, Cindy Weinstein writes that the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin was a catalyst to the war finally breaking out. So much so that when President Abraham Lincoln finally met the author, he cried, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." So much of our real world, this world of politics that the anti-literature people love to talk about, is already itself impacted and shaped by literary production. I'll give you another example. Before Joseph Stalin succeeded Lenin as the leader of the Soviet Union, he had aspirations to become a poet. And at the age of 17, he published patriotic verses about Georgia, his native country. And in Young Stalin, Simon Sebag Montefiore illustrates an episode in which Stalin attempts to pull off a large bank robbery. Stalin needed an inside man to help him accomplish his task. When he scouted the employees for this purpose, he came across an accountant that he used to know from their school days. He told this old friend that he wanted to rob the bank and that he needed his help. And the friend agreed. Why? Because he had passionately admired Stalin's poetry. So Stalin robbed the bank, killed over 40 people, and secured his position in the eyes of Lenin as a significant member of the Bolshevik regime. So, as you have noticed, nowhere in this text do I argue for literature as a vehicle for truth, or even for morals. I am saying that the binary itself that divides truth from falsehood and that separates literature from the real world is itself worthy of being questioned, if not even dismantled. Our understanding of truth in the physical world we inhabit are both shaped by literature, whether texts are well written, moral, politically correct, appropriate for society, and so on and so forth. Literature is part and parcel of what has and what continues to make us human. Today, activists who meddle in the cultural field are constantly asking for literature to be responsible, right? To be smart, kind, gracious, supportive of minorities, and so on and so forth. But even literature that is just genre, that obeys just genre lines, or superficial mass culture, or literature written for younger audiences, or literature that is flat out wrong in its assessments and conclusions, and literature on the wrong end of the moral spectrum, all of them have had a major impact on our physical world. In other words, literature doesn't become impactful when it is well written and moral. Its impact is not immediate. Unlike our doctor example in the beginning of the text, literature's impact is not guaranteed, and it does not depend on morality and facts. You can write literature that is moral and it might not impact people. And you can write literature that is immoral and it might impact people in a positive way, right? You can read a text that is saying bad things and think, I don't want to do that. And you can read a text that is saying good things and you can also think, I don't want to do that. The impact is not guaranteed by the message, by the theme, or even the social standing of the author or artist who create the work. That is not how impact works. Take another example. In a lecture given for the reading agency, the genre writer Neil Gaiman mentioned an important event. After China became a communist state in the middle of the 20th century, it banned literature that wasn't approved of by the major Marxists at the time. In other words, it supported literature that was according to the country's values, moral, responsible, and as close as possible to depicting the world. This is how they thought that literature, this is the Marxist view, by the way, that if you write in this way, you can then impact society on a positive plane. But Neil Gaiman said, quote, I was in China in 2007 at the first party-approved science fiction and fantasy convention in Chinese history. And at one point I took a top official aside and asked him, why? Science fiction had been disapproved of for a long time. What had changed? It's simple, he told me. The Chinese were brilliant at making things if other people brought them the plans, but they did not innovate and they did not invent. They did not imagine. So they sent a delegation to the US, to Apple, to Microsoft, to Google, and they asked the people there who were inventing the future about themselves, and they found that all of them had read science fiction when they were boys or girls, end quote. The moral of the story is that even so-called cheap literature or bad genre literature, and remember what I'm saying, even literature that gets it wrong, literature that might not be politically correct, literature that tries its best to say the truth about the world but fails miserably, not only can that kind of literature still impact people on a personal level and the world at a social level, but that it has and it continues to do so, right? Whether we like it or not, it has shaped our lives and it is still continuing to do so. Why? Because literature and its elements, again, are part and parcel of what makes us human. I have mentioned how it has impacted our nonfiction discourses, our languages and identities, as well as our politics and our technology. But I also mean this on a biological level. Take visual perception as an example. Our eyes are peculiar organs. Remember, we are talking about this binary that sets truth and falsehoods as opposites to one another, or that sets the real world and the world that we perceive through the senses as again separate from one another, which is why books on architecture, philosophy, etc. are therefore more important than books that are perceived through the senses, like fiction, poetry, plays, and so on. But take visual perception as an example. Again, like I said, our eyes are peculiar organs. First, they see reality upside down. Second, reality appears to them as back to front. Third, because our eyes are perpetually flickering, they never actually record a stable scene, because our eyes are constantly vibrating. They don't actually depict a single frame that is accurate. Fourth, because they cannot follow movements, they document screenshots of reality, sending to our brains a few frames or images per second. Fifth, there is a hole in the center of the eye because the optic disc is not equipped with a photon detector. And speaking of photons or light particles, sixth, our eyes are incapable of seeing objects directly. Rather, they perceive the light reflected through them, reflected off them. Seventh, the range that represents visible light, the spectrum of electromagnetic radiation that humans are able to view, is extremely limited. For example, unlike rattlesnakes, humans cannot perceive infrared radiation. In other words, unlike rattlesnakes, humans cannot see in the dark. In other words, darkness itself is subjective to a human perception, right? It's not a reality out there. It is only a thing that humans create when their eyes are trying to engage with the world, and then the brain is doing all of those different things in order at the end to create a full image. But let's continue because we're not done. Eighth, our eyes do not register a three-dimensional reality. They send a two-dimensional image to the brain, which then creates our perception of depth. This is exactly what artists do when they're drawing on a canvas. The canvas is two-dimensional. They're trying to depict reality. What do? They rely on shading. They rely on light colors to create reflection. We are able to do this. We are able to create paintings in a way, for example, that birds are not able to create paintings because our organs themselves are literary or creative, right? We are able to do those things, design an architectural building, because we have the very organs that enable us to perform those creative tasks. But again, we're not done. Ninth, because the average human being possesses two eyes, the left eye and the right eye record varying versions of reality. The brain is later expected to correlate both versions into a single one. And finally, 10, once an eye has documented an image of reality, it does not deliver it as a single frame to the brain. Instead, it disassembles the picture into collections of data, for instance, shapes, colors, luminosity, and so on, and sends these different aspects to also various parts of the brain. We don't engage with reality as reality. We only engage with reality as a creative recreation based on our capacity for imagining, for seeing. For some people are not perceptive, and some people are perceptive. That doesn't mean that the reality itself has changed. It means that this person has worked on their ability to see, has trained their brain and trained their eye to see things that maybe they would usually miss, and the other person has not perhaps done the same thing. It's a creative exercise. In the same way that we all use language to some degree or other, but some of us invest in language so much that they become articulate, and others can't. So Our brains are charged with the colossal tasks of reassembling, redrawing, filling in, stabilizing, aligning, and aligning separate records into a single smooth narrative, and doing so on a rapid, recurrent basis. This fact has led scientists to believe that our brains require a third to a half of its energy, solely to reconstruct our visual, quote-unquote, reality. All right? Understand that this real-time reconstruction occurs whenever we look at something different or simply open our eyes again. So every time you turn your head, your brain has to do all of that again. Every time you blink, your brain has to do all of that again. And by all of that, I literally mean recreate reality for you. It might be crucial now to remind my readers that humans blink on an average of 15 to 20 times per minute, 1,200 times per hour, and approximately 28,800 times a day. That's a massive amount of rewriting reality, or engaging in make-believe, or fictionalizing the truth to render it more manageable, which is really the aspiration of fiction and poetry and other forms of art. So it would be more accurate to rewrite the adage, seeing is believing, into believing is seeing, putting the emphasis on the brain rather than emphasis on the eye as a neutral organ. And we know this, right? How many times when we feel slighted by someone, suddenly we interpret their tone and facial expressions in a negative light, even if they're trying to say things that when we're not feeling hurt, we might not take it as, intended in a negative way. And when we feel jealousy and resentment, we start to see injustice, for example, everywhere. And when we're afraid, suddenly everyone is a monster, is a narcissist, is a villain, is a bad person, right? When we're not afraid, we can just see them as flawed human beings. So the point is that the human body cannot process reality as a fact, right? Or as it is. Rather, human organs themselves grasp the external world via other means. For instance, light bouncing off objects or screenshots instead of movement. And I use the eye as an example, but I don't just mean the eye. I truly am saying that the human being biologically has organs that are creative, which allows us therefore to engage in art, and therefore art is not something that is separate from the human condition. It is part and parcel of it. So take dog whistles as another example. We can't hear them. When the whistle is blown, we can't hear sound. But that doesn't mean that the sound they make doesn't exist and the dog's ears can't hear them either. So, we've touched on a number of things today, and I'd like to ground the final part of this class in a takeaway. So I've been saying since the beginning that the distinction between falsehood and truth, and between participating in the real world and distracting us from living in the real world, is an unhelpful distinction because it is mere conjecture with no basis in reality. And I've also made the claim that literature is impactful even when it does not aspire to be good, moral, well-written, truthful, etc. So why do people still attack literature with the accusations we started with at the beginning of the class? Let's go back to the comparison with the doctors. Science is characterized by experimentation, repetition, and predictable outcomes. Doctors, therefore, are seen as impactful and valuable members of society because they perform tasks that have already been proven to be impactful. Whereas we cannot predict how literature will impact a reader and how this impact will change the world. For instance, Homer did not write his poetry so that Plato can derive philosophical conclusions. Sophocles did not write Oedipus Rex so that Freud can determine thousands of years later the Oedipal complex in psychoanalysis. Like Ovid did not write his poem about Narcissus and Echo so that Freud can come up with the concept of the narcissist, right? And Balzac did not write his novels for Marx. And Tawfiq al-Hakim, certainly we know this from history, did not write Return of the Spirit for Jamal Abdel Nasser to topple the Egyptian government and change the course of Arab history forever. So what do we mean when we say literature is impactful? And why do people like Plato, who want to control society, tell us literature is a waste of time and energy and it should be something that we avoid or engage with only as a consumable item? Like, buy a book, read a book, then go back and live in the real world, right? Why? Why do they tell us those things? And the answer is simple. Because our personal encounters with literature are often unpredictable, unintentional. They transcend physical and temporal conditions. They are multiple and incremental and beyond our individual control. It scares a lot of politically minded people, even those who are well-intentioned and who think they are doing the world a favor by policing bad morals and bad writing and bad themes and bad topics and even bad authors from the cultural sphere. Because literature's impact is powerful yet unpredictable, people tend to want to censor and regulate what can and cannot be said. But try as they might. And again, I am including people who are well-intentioned as well as the control freaks who want everyone to submit to their claims. Literature's impact is not and will not ever be regulated. It has shaped every aspect of what it means to be human today, and it will continue to do so in the future. So yes, maybe one group in one society can try to regulate what can and cannot be said. But the impact of literature itself cannot be regulated, right? I can read a book, like I said, that says bad things, and I can become a better person and impact the world in a better way. Just because a text is saying something, it does not mean that the impact can then be quantified or even predicted. Like you can't, and that's why it's scary, and that's why it's dangerous. Because as I've mentioned in the beginning of the text, it has the power to shape consciousness, it has the power to shape behavior, and it has the power to shape community, it has the power to shape identity, it has the power to shape every aspect of civilization. But I'm hopeful because I know that there will come a time, just like China in 2007, when even those well-intentioned people who are trying to regulate literature, trying to make literature good and moral, etc., even they will understand that literature is impactful because of personal engagements with the text, not because of authorial intention or message or theme or what characters do on a surface level. So, I am a teaching artist who specializes in creative writing. And that's basically what I try to do. I try to awaken in my students their own personal engagements with culture so that they transcend this false binary in the beginning. They stop seeing life as, well, there's the life of the story and then there's the life that is outside the story. That's a false dichotomy. We've already established that that's a false dichotomy. So I encourage my students to start consciously developing their own relationship with the cultural products they interact with. And for specifically the class at the Gulf University for Science and Technology, I presented a list of questions that could help people begin that journey of being conscious, subjective agents in the way that they both recreate themselves and recreate themselves within their communities, as well as the way that they impact this outside world that is inseparable from literary influence. So I hope you like this lecture. Like I said, if you've learned anything from it, let me know in the comments below. Smash a like on the. I sound like a YouTuber. Smash a like on the video if it has benefited you in any way, and if you would like to stay in touch, you can always do so by visiting my website www.nadafaris.com. Thank you all and have a wonderful day.